So my talk today is called Replication Across Individuals. Um, if you want to think of it, you could think of it as a sort of counterpoint or counterpart rather to the talk that Hajime gave last week. It's not exactly a part two, and you don't need to have seen the first part to understand it. But whereas he was talking a lot about the sort of theory behind the sort of work that he and I have been doing, I wanted to show some examples of how it kind of can work in practice, as well as talk about when it might be good to apply the method we've been doing and what you can kind of expect to get out of it. I intend this to be informal, so please feel free to interrupt me at any time with questions. If it goes in the chat, hopefully I'll see it. I'll try to look. You may wonder, incidentally, why there's a picture of a stylized DNA here. The real reason is that apparently now, whenever you make a new slide, PowerPoint tries to suggest a picture that it can put in next to your slide to make it look cool. And I guess it picked up on replication and thought DNA. But I thought it's kind of fitting given the subject material we're going to be talking about, which you can come to in a sec. So I kept occasionally at suggestions, but not for every single slide. So a broad outline. First, I'm going to talk about why replicate across individuals. I mean, what do I even mean by replicating across individuals, but then why do it? And a little bit about how, though, like I said, a lot of that was covered by Hajime's presentation, and I will try not to repeat too much, though hopefully enough that people can keep with me. The second section deals with the question whether it actually works. So we've talked a lot about it in theory, that we're going to do this special method, but I want to show what I feel is, at least to me, convincing evidence that this is a plausible way to do things. It yields consistent results that are in line with what we would expect to see. And then section 3, which we'll get to if there's time, is just a few sort of teaser things about applications that we're doing. A lot of this stuff has come up in the last year or so, some of it in the last few months. So some of this is kind of hot off the presses stuff, which is exciting. And I'm happy to talk more about any aspect during a question period or discussion later, or even if you want to interrupt me and have me tangent about something. Section 1, why replicate across individuals and how? And I guess individuals triggers PowerPoint to suggest me these little wooden men who are different colors. So, I mean, there's going to be a theme here, right? They're all different, but yet there's certain replicable aspects across these little men. They're all the same shape. So again, I thought it was an okay image. But so the importance of the individual. So going all the way back to Chomsky and basic ideas about the language faculty, the idea is that it was part of the so-called genetic endowment, meaning that it's fully instantiated in each human being, or at least any linguistically competent human being. Of course, some people may have a brain damage or something that would damage that, but assuming none of that holds, we all fully have inside of us a language faculty. This is the idea of language as a property of the biological organism, as opposed to a property of, say, the society or a sort of Platonic idea floating out there. It's something that's within you, every person. Chomsky further went on to claim that fundamental property of this genetic endowment was syntactic structure. That sentences, when they're represented at some level in our minds, aren't just strings of words. They're units grouped into bigger units, in a very particular way. And so if you believe this picture, one task, it's not at all the only task that one could do, but one task would be to show that this universal structure idea, that we can find some evidence of that existing in every single person without any exception. And that's a tall order. The one way we might hope to go about this, which is how people have gone about it, is find some sort of way that this structure predictably influences the way sentences get interpreted. So is there some link between the sort of abstract structure that we hypothesize for a sentence and what the sentence means that's not something obvious? I mean, obviously, if the subject is Daniel, the means that Daniel did it or received it or whatever. That's not the kind of link we're interested in. Something that wouldn't be predicted if there weren't structure. And we can start with our own selves. This is one of the nice things about studying language, is that you can ask yourself, are there certain sentence patterns that reliably don't allow certain interpretations that are in ways that are somewhat unexpected if it was just a sort of flat structure? But if we only check our own judgments, even though that's a good first step, we don't know if the results are universal or just some quirk of our own particular language. As it turns out, if we want to replicate our judgments across multiple people, or indeed across everyone, that's very, very, very difficult. So I think anyone who's worked with linguistic data knows, judgment data knows, people disagree quite a lot. Some of those can be relegated to noise from people not understanding certain things or having certain different ways of interpreting things, but some of it seems to be genuine. There are sentence meaning pairs that if you ask one person, can these two things go together? They say, yes, absolutely. And you ask that person's twin brother who's lived in the same area as them their whole life, and they say, no, those things couldn't ever go together. And this just seems to be an irreducible variability in judgments that really gets in the way of establishing any simple hard and fast rules. Now, it depends very much what you care about and what you're trying to do, how you approach this variability. If you have taken as an assumption, which I'd say it's fair to say most people do, that this basic Chomskyan idea about the universal grammar is right, then you may be licensed to kind of say, well, some of this is just kind of necessary noise. We can look past it. We can use things like a very simple statistic, like what's the majority opinion, right? If we have this majority judgment, 7 out of 10 people all share this judgment. Maybe if our purpose is something kind of high level, like doing the right analysis of the sentence for this other reason, we can just go with that or go with some other more elaborate statistical claim. But our very particular purpose is demonstrating the universality of syntactic structure, that it's instantiated in every single individual. That's what Hajime and I and our working group have been trying to do. And so for us, something like, well, the majority of people show this, that is not quite strong enough evidence. It's good, it's consistent, but if you want to say that we have this pattern that's obvious, like a piece of evidence for abstract syntactic structure existing in everyone, if some people don't get that pattern, then that's actually could be thought of as a counterexample to the claim. So in the face of this variation, we have 3 basic goals. The first is to show that despite the variation, there are still universally true patterns that we can identify that do govern sentence interpretation pairs. These may not be terribly straightforward because, as we've seen, there is this true variability, but we believe we can still find them, and we're trying to find them. The second goal, which is sort of a subset of the first, is to show that these, we can term them laws of language, make reference to syntactic structure. So it's not that just that there are patterns that you can find, but that those seem to rely on abstract structure, just like Chomsky had predicted. There may be other factors other than syntactic structure. And this is one of the things where we sometimes diverge from other syntax groups who would like to subsume everything under syntax. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. Our interest is to show that there is syntactic structure at all. And finally, hopefully in doing this, we can refine our picture of that structure. So what specific properties does it have? What does it make reference to? We may be able to talk about that a little bit in the third section here. Now, to ground this in something specific, which is something Hajime talked a lot about in his talk, we can use these particular type of interpretations. The most crucial one for us has been this thing called BVA. Some people have called it binding, quantificational binding. I think a lot of you are familiar with it, but for those who aren't, if we look at this sentence here, every professor spoke to his student. This, incidentally, this picture is one of my recent experimental stimuli. If we look at this, there's there could be others, but 2 major ways of interpreting this, specifically relating to what you take the meaning of his student to be. So the more normal non-BVA reading, or at least more simple, is that his student refers to someone in particular student, John's student. And so every professor spoke to John's student. The BVA way is to relativize his to each professor. So his student doesn't refer to one particular person's student. It's saying that every professor spoke to their own student. So A spoke to A's student, B spoke to B's student, C spoke to C's student. A much more kind of elaborate meaning. And this particular elaborate meaning has been known for a long time to be selectively available. One can't always get it in every context. That's great, but at the same time, as I was talking about, there are deep divisions between people about when it is and isn't available that really complicate our attempt to use it as evidence for anything. Our basic approach is to assume more or less that there are three types of factors that control whether this BVA interpretation is available or not. It may not be specific three factors, but three broad types. And this class, so the idea we've had for a long time, this particular way of exposition is somewhat new, so you can let me know if this makes sense or not. Some of these factors are purely external in that they are properties more or less of the form of the sentence alone. Anyone could notice them. So the fact that every professor precedes his student in the sentence is one such factor. It's not up for debate whether that's true. It does precede it. And we have found that precedence alone can frequently facilitate these BVA readings. Another type of factor, the one we're most interested in, are these structural factors. So which elements are structurally higher than others? And this is C command. I say structurally higher just for those, especially some of whom I've invited, who may not know the term C command. But so if we hypothesize that one of these elements sits in a position that sort of asymmetrically commands the other in the structure, that's also been said to be able to facilitate BVA readings. Now, this structure is not obvious from the form. Just looking at it, you don't know what C commands what sits where in the structure, but we can hypothesize that. We can hypothesize which sentences correspond to which types of structures. So it's not purely external, but it's somehow reachable by the external via hypotheses. The third type of factor is a probably quite non-homogeneous set of factors, which I'm calling here purely internal. So things like, what sort of mental representation does a person assign to the word his? What kind of context do they imagine things happening in? A lot of things like that. What's their kind of world knowledge state, their emotional state? These are things that we can never hope to read off of the sentence itself. We could never know beforehand, what a person's life experience with the word every is. But they're not unreachable, right? We can diagnose them via independent tests once we have the person sitting down. So we can find out about them. We just can't pre-hypothesize that they're there or not. Our general approach is that we want to remove the influences of the non-structural factors, which, if we can do it correctly and in the right circumstances, will clear up the picture and allow the effects of structure to be seen. And assuming that we don't just kind of throw out the places where we've removed things, but we instead look at it in a kind of schematic way, will allow people who have judgments that seem to go against structure-based predictions to be accounted for in predictable manners. So if we can diagnose beforehand that a person is showing some sort of internal effect, special effect on the word his, for example, that would somehow just, make it not sensitive to structure, and indeed they give us a judgment that's not corresponding to our structure-based predictions, well, now we have a very principled way of explaining that. So instead of just discounting people, we're actually giving an explanation as to why their judgments varied. And specifically want to show that this variation in judgments can be reduced to variation in which of these factors are influencing the speaker at the given time. So we're going to assume roughly that BVA is controlled by these three factors. One is just word precedence, so whether the so-called binder, which in this sentence was every professor, precedes the bindee, which is his, or his. If you prefer to think of it as his student, you can, but it's really more technically his. So which one comes first? Purely external factor. That the binder C commands the bindee in the structure, that it sits in a structurally privileged position to the bindee, or that the bindee or binder have some special internal factors that are complicating their behavior. Hajime's talk last week covered a lot of how to check for 3, which is important, but not necessarily too crucial for understanding what I'm going to show. I will go over it a little bit. But so just in summary for this first section, our primary goal then is to show that despite all this variation, some of which is really true variation, we can still find definite reflexes of a universal language faculty. There are truly hard and fast laws of language. They just have to be laws that account for variation. And importantly, the variation that exists can be reduced to interactions of these different factors. And one of those factors is definitely abstract syntactic structure, or so we'd like to claim. And through the lens of things like BVA and when it's available and when it's not, we can both demonstrate that there's this universal cognitive reality of a syntactic structure, as well as, again, we may get to talk about this, maybe not, further identify some of its fine-grained properties. So this brings me to the second section, which is replication across individuals and how it is indeed reproducible. Here, again, I think it got picked up on the individuals. And I guess to be an individual, you're the one little light man in the sea of more dark men. But he looks happy, like he achieved a successful replication of its judgment. So I just kept it. So we're gonna look at a very simple and straightforward case. So if we think of a basic transitive sentence, it has a subject, a verb, and an object. We hypothesize that those sentences correspond to this structure here, one where crucially the verb and the object are grouped together to the exclusion of the subject. And in terms of C command, that means that the subject C commands the object and everything inside the object. And thus his, if the object is something like his student. So if we have every teacher spoke to his student, every teacher is the subject, his student is the object, every teacher C commands his, BVA should in principle be available. On the other hand, if we have the reverse, his student spoke to every teacher, now every teacher is down in the object, his student is up in the subject. There's not this special higher than relationship between every teacher and his. And so if structure is the only factor at play, BVA readings should be disallowed. His student spoke to every teacher should not be able to mean A's student spoke to A, B's student spoke to B, C's student spoke to C. And for many people, it can't. But on the other hand, for many people, myself included, it can. So turning to the first experiment, which is really the first experiment also that I really did. So it's experiment 1 in more than one sense. This was a very, very simple experiment. You could think of it almost like a toy experiment. There was just 10 questions, 4 of which were just testing whether the people were attentive. So we were using online participants. They work for, it's a fair payment, I think, but it's not particularly high. There's not particularly much of a consequence for them guessing randomly. So you have to check to make sure that they're paying attention and also that they understand the task. 4 sentences that we're testing for internal factors, and I'll come back to that in a sec, and then 2 BVA questions. The most crucial one was this sentence. His student spoke to every teacher, and then we asked them, in essence, can that have a BVA reading? So can there be multiple people referred to by his student, which vary with the teacher? And for anyone who is attentive and who doesn't have any of these internal factors going on, we predict that they must reject the BVA reading, all of them universally. There was also a control sentence, which was like every teacher spoke to his student, where the BVA was predicted to be possible. And the point of this is just to make sure that if people reject BVA in the crucial sentence, we want to make sure that they do accept it sometimes. If they're just universal, I hate this kind of reading people, who knows what that means? That doesn't really tell us about the influence of structure, just tells us about how much they don't like BVA. Now, technically, this control sentence was actually to his student, every teacher spoke, just because we wanted to match the word order of the crucial sentence. So as I mentioned, precedence alone seems to be able to facilitate BVA. So a sentence like every teacher spoke to his student, if someone accepts that, we don't really know if that's because it was a nice structure or just because every teacher came first. But in this one, to his student, every teacher spoke, we think it roughly corresponds to the same structure. It's got the same sort of style of arguments, same subject, same object. Just his comes first, so that eliminates the concern. Now, before I summarize the results, I need to explain a little bit about how to read our graphs. And I think Hajime talked a little bit about this last week. But I think it's a fairly crucial point because generally the distinction between people who can kind of follow what we're talking about and people who can't is whether they can read these kind of overly fancy graphs. But so the graph will be a series of dots. In fact, I'll show you right now, it's over here. Each of these dots is an individual's judgment. So this is one person's judgment, this is one person's judgment, this is one person's judgment, all of them. The information about those different judgments are represented in different ways. Crucially, you probably can notice that each dot has a color, and those represent their judgments on the BVA sentences. So there's green, yellow, and red dots. Green are the ones who behave according to the structural predictions. So those are the people who reject this sentence. His student spoke to every teacher. They don't like BVA when there's not the appropriate structure. They also accept the control sentence. So it's not just about disliking BVA. It's got to do with what structure the sentence is presented in, the interpretation is presented in. Red are the opposite. They accept the crucial sentence, the one that is anti-structurally allowing for BVA. And then there's yellow, which are the people who rejected it always. They're like green in that they rejected the sentence they were supposed to reject. We just don't really know why or whether it's significant. So you can see here that there's roughly a third of each. So roughly a third red, roughly a third green, roughly a third yellow. That means that 2/3 of people rejected the sentence that we hoped they would reject. His student spoke to every teacher. But about a third of them, and I've found this multiple times, seem to accept it. So we certainly can't say that that sentence is obviously impossible. This is where these circles come in. So there's 3 circles. These represent their other non-BVA judgments. So for example, the circle on top represents their judgments on the attentiveness checking questions. If they're inside that circle, it means that they were attentive. They passed whatever test we were asking to make sure that they were paying attention. You can see that most people are inside this top circle. Most people were paying enough attention that we passed them. The other 2 circles have to do with these internal effects, which I can briefly review. If this is too complicated, I know for some people this kind of like gives them a headache, you can kind of tune out. We won't come back to this too much, though I'm happy to talk about it more if people have questions. But basically, to be said to not have an internal factor affecting them, both binder and bindee have to demonstrate structural sensitivity through something other than BVA, because otherwise that would be completely circular. This involves, there's a few components, but the major one is rejecting certain anti-structural readings. So for example, if we have the sentence, 2 students spoke to every professor, and we ask whether this can mean 2 students per each professor. So one reading would be 2 students total, and one would be 2 students twice as many as there are professors. So 2 to Professor 1, another 2 to Professor 2, so on, so on. That reading, which is called DR if you were at the last talk, is also anti-structural, right? Every professor is sitting down in a low object position, yet it's acting as if it has this sort of wide scope in semantics terms. It's somehow taken a position higher than 2 students. If they can allow that, then every professor is not particularly structurally sensitive. There seem to be internal factors not obvious from the sentence structure, that are letting every professor get away with doing some extra things. And if you look here, individuals with no effects on the binder, actually most people are letting every professor get away with doing non-structural things, or at least we can't be sure that they're not. That's very common for English speakers, especially with words like every professor. I know we had Hayashishita Ringe in the audience for a while here. He kind of has talked about how universal quantifiers like every are very good at being non-structural, like taking really high positions, especially in English. So this is not unusual, but there are people for whom every is stuck in its low down position. We do a similar thing with his. So we have a sentence like his student spoke to John with the his equals John reading. So whether this can mean John's student spoke to John. Again, structurally, John isn't above his. So if his can kind of pick up the meaning from John, that's a sign that it's also behaving anti-structurally or astructurally. Some people have claimed that that his can always refer to John. This has been said about English, though it's been said to be different than, say, Japanese, but this isn't true at all. So there are lots of people who can't get this anti-structural his reading. So yeah, so there's different colored dots and different circles. Again, the dots, the color of the dots are the individual's BVA judgments, and the circles are the various criteria that might make them accept BVA when there isn't structural licensing of BVA. And we can see that crucially in the center of the three circles, in the intersection, people who passed all of our little tests, those people are never read. They never accept his student spoke to every teacher with a BVA reading. Many of them are green, meaning that they do accept BVA readings when there is the right C command, but when that C command is not there, when the structure is wrong, they reject it. And that is totally consistent with structural hypotheses. Now, this isn't to say we've thrown out everyone else. Instead, like I said before, we're actually accounting for why there's variation. So if we look at this individual here on the next to the central intersection, but not quite inside it, inside the attentive circle and the individuals with no effects on bindee circle, there's 5 of such individuals who are red. They're outside the individuals with no internal effects on the binder circle. So we can pretty clearly see why they accepted non-structural BVA. They had a binder, every teacher, which was already diagnosed as being not sensitive to structure, having this internal effect that lets it act as if it were higher. Ditto, these 3 red on the kind of opposite side, who had no internal effects on the binder, but had one on the bindee. So for them, his was able to do things outside of structure. But when you put together people like that who have neither of those effects, we get an extremely consistent picture. Everyone rejects structureless BVA or not structurally supported BVA. Now, maybe we got lucky, right? There's 10 people in here. Now, when you look about the probabilities of the 10, none of them being reds, if it's just like a coin flip, it's actually very low. But, you know, statistical anomalies happen. Maybe the chances aren't weighted equally. There could be a lot of things. Or maybe something about the way we set up the first experiment bias people in one way or another. These are all pretty reasonable concerns that one might have. So in the second experiment, we made a lot of changes. So instead of just having kind of one item per condition, there was quite a lot of items per condition. So multiple BVA crucial sentences, multiple tests for the internal factors, multiple attentiveness checks. Question order was much more randomized than in the first experiment. We had 2 different groups of individuals with different binders. So some got every teacher and some got more than one teacher. So we actually doubled the number of participants. And there was the same crucial sentence type, which was this simple transitive bindee verb binder, which again, the bindee is not in the correct structural position to receive BVA. But the control sentence changed to be a passive. So if you notice here, his student spoke to every teacher and every teacher spoke to his student. Technically, these are different, not only in word order, but also in what's getting what role, right? In his student spoke to every teacher, the students are speaking, every teacher spoke to his student, the teachers are speaking. So maybe that has an effect. Turns out it doesn't seem like it does. But just in case, we checked it. And despite this change in setup, we got exactly the same results qualitatively. Some people, a lot of reds, some people do accept BVA without the right C command. But again, there's always a reason for their departure from the structural prediction, right? So either they're not attentive, or they have an internal effect on the bindee or an internal effect on the binder. Anyone who is attentive and doesn't have either of those 2 things, the people in the center intersection, they never accept his student spoke to every professor or every teacher, or his student spoke to more than one teacher. They're extremely consistent. And just to drive home this point, kind of beating it to death, switching methodologies again. Instead of online surveys, like the previous experiments, now let's do it in a kind of one-on-one Zoom interview session. They're not really free-form interviews. They're answering a set of questions, but it's a face-to-face thing rather than online participants in a kind of anonymous experiment. This in some ways kind of helps because they can ask questions and other things like that. This experiment was very elaborate and we can only look at a small sub portion of it. It was dealing with more things than just what I've been talking about, but it had multiple different control sentences, topicalized, we moved around, passives, topicalized passives, multiple different constructions were being tested. The options were displayed in this graphical way I was showing before instead of verbally. And we had, in fact, 3 pairings of binder and bindee per person. The first was every professor and his or their. We let people have a choice in this case because some English speakers don't like his student referring back to every professor. Some prefer it to be their student. It's gender neutral. So we every professor and his/their student, every professor but one and his/their own student. So some have said, and I think it's true, that the phrase their own student or his own student is much more likely to get this BVA reading. And a third one, more than one professor and that professor's student. So now that professor isn't even a pronoun, it's a nominal phrase. But it turns out these all work exactly the same way. So I've put the number of the pairing next to the dot. You can see there's 1s and 2s and 3s. In this case, because of the nature of the setup, we didn't really need to use attentiveness in the same way. And this data is a little bit preliminary. It was taken quite recently. But you can see in the middle, no reds again. No one who has the right properties ever accepts these anti-structural BVA readings. For them, always sentences like that professor's student spoke to more than one professor can't have a bound reading. Whereas most of them are green. So they're fine with things like more than one professor spoke to that professor's student, even if you topicalize it or change it into a passive or any of those things. So we've pretty consistently found, no matter how you sort of vary the setup, as long as you do controls well enough, you get almost boringly similar results. I've basically shown you the same graph 3 times, right? Always there's reds, but in the center, no reds. Always the people with the 3 crucial properties, or 2, never accept the sentence that they're not supposed to accept. And of course, these are not the same graph. They're actually different because they're all different people. We have now, well over 300 people across 3 different types of experiment, but they're all converging to the same result. And so across all individuals, the same implicational law holds, the same correlation holds, that if, assuming the person is attentive, and assuming they don't have an internal effect of some sort that we've diagnosed as interfering, and assuming there's not this confound of precedence, BVA is only possible from subject into object. It's completely impossible from something in the object to subject. This may seem like it only applies to the people in the center, but it applies to everyone, right? It's just that the people outside the center have not met the precondition for the particular prediction to apply. That doesn't mean that it isn't true of them. It's just true in a kind of null way, in a kind of degenerate way. So this is a true law. Anyone with the right properties will obey it, just not everyone has the particular properties at the particular time with the particular lexical items that we're using. And you may say, well, still, it would be better to demonstrate this with everyone that you could. The more people who are in the center, the more we've shown that the structure is universal across all people. And we agree. And that's why you can see, comparing the percentage of people who get in the center here and the percentage who get in here, it's much higher in this one. Even though there's much fewer participants, there's actually a larger number of judgments in the center. Of course, some of those judgments are from the same person, but most of them are different people. And so we are trying to take as many people as we can with us, but that doesn't change the fact that the sort of laws we're describing do apply to all people. Just sometimes we have principled reasons for seeing why another sort of law, another sort of factor might be overruling the predicted result. But everyone is in fact acting according to the predicted result, just some people aren't acting according to structural predictions. So it's a predicted exception from predictions. So I think we have enough time to talk to at least some of these section 3 things. So again, we have a lovely suggestion from PowerPoint. I don't know, I guess skydiving is an achievement, but there were individuals in this, so I kept it. But so I just want to talk about some things that we can learn from doing this method. So hopefully I've convinced you that it gives very consistent results. And that's a kind of a necessary thing for any method, that it's reliable, that we can expect the predicted results not only to obtain, but to reproduce. But can we do anything more other than just handling a very specific question about how the language faculty works? And the answer is yes. So I just want to look at a few things. There's other things we could also talk about, but one question is, which we've addressed a little bit, how does changing the lexical items, the choices of binder and bindee, affect things? Another thing is, how about looking across different languages? Is this just specific to English? If it's universal, it had better not be. And then finally, perhaps the most interesting thing from a certain point of view is the replication or extension of these results to new types of constructions. We don't have too much time to talk about the details of different lexical items, but you can note from the previous discussion that I never made any predictions that were relativized to the item, right? In this one, for example, the 3 binders and 3 bindees, they all behaved the same. Now they had different distributions in this correlation. We can see that a lot of red of the 2 pair, which was kind of predicted because it's his or their own student, and a lot of green of the 1 and 3, but all of them are obeying the same correlations. All of them obey the same implicational principle. It's just that they get sort of shifted in their distribution along the permissible spectrum of variation that this law kind of sets out. And so it seems, as far as we have yet found, and there may be exceptions out there, but the binders and bindees that we've looked at so far are all following the same basic pattern, which is that so long as there aren't these internal effects going on and there aren't precedence issues, they will be pretty much perfectly sensitive to C-command when it comes to BVA. We'll see a little bit more about why one might care about this when we look at other languages, but there has been a lot of discussion recently about this idea of some bindees being these logophores, some being just inherently not sensitive to structure. I think that the true picture is actually much more complicated, in that whether something is structurally sensitive or not is not so much a property of the word in abstract, but is something that different people assign to different words in different constructions at different times. So it's actually, in some ways, all the binders are the same when it comes to this law, even though they have different idiosyncratic behaviors. Those idiosyncratic behaviors all subsume under this general pattern. And now looking at the different languages, so I should first note that the English results in the previous section were actually replicating Hajime's results for Japanese. So even what we just saw was already a replication of something that was found in another language. But recently I've been looking at experiments in Korean and Mandarin Chinese, and give a special thanks to Yuna Yi and Felix Chen, at least one of whom is here, they may both be here, for helping me to design and conduct those. As an English speaker going in, it would be very hard, but I had help making the experiments and also running them on people. And what we find is exactly the same results. The Korean experiment, I would show you a graph, but it would be a very boring graph, because for this particular construction, not all constructions, but the Korean speakers never accepted BVA without C-command of the binder, the bindee by the binder. So sentences like, his student spoke to, it was every professor, his student, or praised every professor, they never accepted those. Of the few people that we talked to, it was only about 10 individuals, but we asked them it several times with different options. We had these 3 pairs though, like with the English, so there was an every professor and a his student. If you know Korean, I have this here, but the his is kind of like English is, roughly, some differences. But we also had an all professors except one paired with this chashin word, or we could also use tagi, which is this, we have it in Japanese, jibun jishin, in Chinese, you have ziji. We don't really have it in English, but it's a word that is sort of like the self and himself, but more general. And interestingly, though, the his and Tashin, the self thing, have been said to have many different properties. With regard to this, they were identical in always being sensitive to structural constraints. Now, in other things, they were not always sensitive, but they were always principled departures that we could detect beforehand. And we also had a more than one professor and that professor student, the same demonstrative thing. Some people you'll see were yellow for this. Some people never let that professor student get to be in BVA with anything, but most people here do. So this again replicates the results from English and Japanese, in fact, even more clearly, right? There's very little variation when it comes to the Korean. Similarly with Chinese, we had exactly the same sort of setup. Almost no one accepted the anti-structural BVA. One person did with the second pairing, which was most professors and this ziji, like Tashin, like Jibun. But that person had already been diagnosed as having an internally affected ziji. So that is fitting with the correlations. And again, we also saw that this nominal, that professor student, people also accept binding. Chinese speakers are very split on whether that professor student can ever get bound. Half of them just never wanted to bind it. The other half thought it was okay. And so we found this very interesting convergence. So results from 4 languages now, Japanese, English, Korean, and Mandarin Chinese, all follow the same implicational pattern. They all say that as long as there isn't this diagnosed internal effect, as long as there isn't this confound from precedence, then the structural rules pretty much perfectly apply, at least to attentive people. And so this supports our structural hypothesis about subjects and objects, which I have repeated here, that subjects are just inherently higher in the structure than objects, at least in the type of sentences we've been looking at, and that there is this link between BVA and the structure. And now, importantly, many of these languages are quite different from one another, as I know all too well. As an English speaker who has tried to learn both Korean and Chinese, they're both very different in English, and unfortunately for me, very different from each other. So they have all these differences that might make you think that the same rules would not apply. But somehow, since they all seem to follow these predictions, it seems that they really do assign the same sort of structure to the subject-verb-object sentences, or in the case of Japanese and Korean, subject-object-verb for the most part sentences. They all say that the subject has this privileged position above the object. And they all seem to share this structural requirement for BVA that, assuming nothing else is going on, indeed, the binder really does have to C-command the bindee. And so this looks very much like an aspect of so-called universal grammar, right? There's very little you would expect would kind of about Japanese, English, Korean, Chinese that would make you think, oh yeah, these will all function the same way with this really kind of obscure interpretation in these sort of convoluted situations, and yet they all do. And so this looks very much like a human universal. Turning finally, yeah, I think we have time to talk about looking at other constructions. So I mentioned that we looked at passives as control sentences. In fact, we can use them as crucial sentences too. For example, his student was praised by every professor. Again, his student is in the subject position. It's not going to be C-commanded by every professor, which is not the object, but it's in a by phrase somewhere. We predict that, assuming no other factor intervenes, everyone should reject this sentence. And indeed, this is more or less what happens. I won't show the graphs just for the sake of time. In English and Korean, they look exactly like the graphs you've been seeing all day. Green's in the center, yellow's in the center, red's not in the center. Chinese was a little more complicated. Me and Felix are working on something to address this. Chinese passives act a little bit differently. They resist some of the topicalization stuff we need to do. We're going to follow up on this, but nothing too crucial happens in Chinese either. But the more interesting thing that I want to talk about is this case of possessor binding or spec binding, which is in sentences like, every professor's colleague spoke to his student. And that's with the BVA reading. So this would be like, Professor 1's colleague spoke to Professor 1's student, Professor 2's colleague spoke to Professor 2's student, 3's colleague to 3 student, so on, so on, so on. Here, if we look at the little graph I have here, the possessor is inside the subject. It's not the subject. And so it doesn't have the same sort of asymmetric relationship to the object. It's actually kind of at the same level as the object. But crucially, it doesn't sit structurally in an obviously commanding position. So we would expect, if BVA really just relies on the simple notion of C-command, the simple notion of which thing is in the higher position, that then binding from the possessor into the object ought to be disallowed. Yet many, many, many people think sentences like every professor's colleague spoke to a student can have BVA readings. This has been noted for as long as pretty much people have been talking about the role of structure in BVA since Reinhardt days. So some have taken this to argue that either BVA really doesn't depend on syntactic structure, what we were seeing before was kind of an illusion, or maybe we're wrong about basic C-command being the structure to look at. Maybe there's another relationship where the possessor does stand in a different position to the object. This was and has been popular in kind of alternative theories of C-command, starting with Kane in the 90s. We're going to show that I don't think you need to adopt either of these. So one thing that turns out you do need to control for linear precedence. So notice here, every professor's colleague spoke to his student. Every professor comes before his. We can fix this by moving to his student to the front, to his student, every professor's colleague spoke. That was fine when it was just to his student, every professor spoke. But now with the addition of colleague, this is going to cause different things to happen. So once you do that, and you also check for these other effects, internal effects is every professor structurally sensitive, is his student structurally sensitive. Again, you get the same sort of result. You have greens in the center, no reds in the center. Reds exist, a lot of reds exist, but they all show some telltale signs of why they would accept an anti-structural BVA. People who don't show those signs don't accept these possessor bindings. And now there's not too many people in the center here. That's partially to do with how complicated these sentences are. People got kind of confused, like, is it the professor student, the colleague student? But we have replicated this multiple times in English, as well as in Korean and Mandarin Chinese. It's really evident in Mandarin Chinese, where a lot of people, they just love it when you have the linear precedence, but move to his student from the front, or his student in this case, and they never accept it, basically. A few people do, but then they show these telltale other signs. So we don't need to revise the definition of C-command or say that BVA is not structurally sensitive. Again, when you look at truly structurally sensitive people, they all reject possessor binding, assuming you control for linear precedence. So this is a way that looking at things at the kind of fine-grained individual level lets us uncover things that were maybe missed by more kind of broad generalizations or kind of collapsing across people and across conditions. So this is a nice thing that we're starting to learn. We still have a lot more work to do on this to really demonstrate that indeed it's C-command and not some other relationship that's modulating it, but this is a kind of promising start for us. So just concluding about this section 3. So replicating across individuals is in fact robust across different lexical items, across different syntactic constructions, and even different languages. And nicely, this kind of replication lets us test different hypotheses. It doesn't just show the same result over and over again. It lets us distinguish between different pictures of how the universal grammar works, how structure impacts meaning, whether C-command is the simple way or something more complex. And further, though I didn't get a chance to talk about it, but it's been kind of implicit, it lets us look at the effects of other factors other than structure, right? So the reds who are outside of the, the circles here, the ones who do have internal effects, this is showing us the power of internal effects to facilitate BVA readings. So again, to reiterate, we're not discarding them. We're actually looking at them in a new light, in a way that we kind of understand why they are principled exceptions. Concluding thoughts, and again, we have some DNA. This one I forced it to put in because I wanted the symmetry with DNA. It didn't suggest that based on concluding thoughts. So replication across individuals is a vehicle by which we can demonstrate that there really are these universal laws of language. They are not simple laws, they are correlational laws. They are laws that require you to get a handle of variation, but they do exist. And as far as we can see, they are pretty inviolable, which is an exciting result. And even more exciting for us is that they really do seem to make reference to syntactic structure. So if you have controlled both the external factors like precedence and the internal factors like whether every and his are not structurally sensitive, if you have the right structure, BVA will still be allowed. It's still permissible. It's only when the syntactic facilitation is removed that it becomes truly universally unacceptable. And replication of this sort, as I talked about in section 3, can enhance our understanding of the language faculty, both by demonstrating that sort of universal and discriminating between hypotheses at a fine-grained level. And to leave with a concluding thought that I was rather inspired by PowerPoint's suggestion of DNA. So a major discovery of 20th century biology was that all cellular life was in essence a manifestation of a formal system encoded in DNA. The formal system is essentially just various sequences of 4 different chemical letters. It's a little bit more complicated, but basically sequences of these abstract nucleotides and some kind of cellular devices for reading off of those and translating them into various proteins. We're trying to find the same thing in a sense for linguistic utterances, a very, very basic system that underlies their structure and some devices that read that structure into form and meaning like BVA and the way the sentence is structured. These may seem like kind of very simplistic things. So why are we spending so much time on these kind of saying that the subject C commands the object, which is not at all a controversial statement in generative linguistics. But the idea is studying these very basic building blocks at the level of individual can expose both the properties of the system that are formal and the properties that are stochastic, that are random with respect to the system. And the fact that it's kind of so simple and kind of underspecified, that's true of DNA too, right? So we have all these different types of animals, plants, funguses, all these different structures. But if we reduce it back to the fundamental thing that's going on, they're all manifestations of these DNA codes. Similarly, we have all these different types of sentences, interpretations, what have you. They're all manifestations of basic structure building operations. And crucially, looking at, instead of the outward phenomena, the animals, the sentences, the interpretations, but instead these very basic mechanisms, these structural, internal, external factors, or these nucleotides of DNA, C command, that shifts our kind of focus from this outward world with a lot of things to these few underlying mechanisms that can generate a huge range of variety and different types of surface manifestations of this formal system. And so what we're really trying to do is show that everything reduces to just a few basic interacting parts. And then once you've satisfied that constraint, you can build anything you want off of that. And so in that sense, I think that the link to DNA is very apt. And so thank you very much. It suggested this, it's appropriate. Merry late Christmas to everyone who celebrates. I'm very happy to take questions now.